Sorry. All right, so then clicker here. Also, just some real quick housekeeping before we Amy takes us away. We've got bathrooms down the hall, women's bathrooms upstairs, men's bathroom on the first floor, and then there's also legal bathrooms to my right. Thank you all.
Okay, hi. My name is Amy Shawnette. I am a second-year master's student at University of Minnesota. Super weird to be presenting in person. My entire grad school experience has been pretty much online. So yeah, it's nice to see you in person and hopefully I don't screw it up.
Sorry, well, I've already screwed it up, so we're off to a great start.
Okay, then I can
guess
restart and not say that.
Now we're screen sharing. All right.
Okay. So the title of my talk is Evaluating Composition, Structure, and Regeneration in Tamarack Forests Impacted by Eastern Larch Beetle. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, my graduate advisor, Dr. Marcella Wynn-Mueller-Campione, and then Mike Reinekainen and Paul Dubuque from the Minnesota DNR Silviculture Program. This project is a partnership between the University of Minnesota and the Minnesota DNR, and we're funded by a forest health monitoring grant from the U.S. Forest Service. So just a brief overview of the talk. I'm going to go over Tamarack basics in Minnesota, introduce my research questions, briefly touch on study design. We'll spend most of our time considering results, and then we'll wrap up with talking about what these results mean for forest managers. So as many of you probably know, for the past 20 years, Minnesota has experienced an unprecedented landscape level outbreak of Eastern Larch Beetle, or ELB for short. Eastern Larch Beetle is a native bark beetle that kills tamarack, also known as Eastern Larch. Historically, ELB outbreaks have been small in scale and cause only scattered tree mortality. However, since the 1970s, outbreaks have intensified across Tamarack's range in the northern United States and Canada. In 2001, the Minnesota DNR began tracking widespread ELB damage in tamarack forests. This graph shows the exponential increase in acreage affected by ELB since 2001. As of 2022, 58% of Minnesota's 1.4 million acres of tamarack have been impacted by Eastern Larch Beetle. That 58% represents 816,833 acres. That's nearly 817,000 acres from this healthy forest on the left to this damaged forest on the right. Kind of a not fun before and after makeover. Now, one caveat with this information, I like to show these photos for dramatic effect. I think it tells the story of ELB really well. But there's a lot of variability in the level of damage across our tamarack stands. So impacted by ELB means there's some level of impact that could be low severity damage or high severity. That said, a lot of it kind of looks like a tamarack graveyard. So the big factor driving this outbreak is climate change. Increasing temperatures are changing the ELB life cycle and behavior. Recent ELB research focuses mainly on the insect. So there's a lot that we don't know about how trees and other vegetation respond to ELB disturbance. In a 2019 paper, Crocker et al. Modeled tree and stand level factors associated with tamarack mortality and found that large diameter was the strongest predictor of tamarack mortality. But this really only gets at what's happening in the forest before and during the outbreak. And we're curious about what's happening after. So why do we want to keep tamarack on the landscape? In addition to its cultural and economic value, tamarack is a major component of boreal peatland ecosystems, which perform critical ecological functions. But with no regeneration, tamarack forests may transition to unforested wetlands. So we should manage tamarack forests for maximum ecological benefits, but do we? As many of you probably know, managing tamarack is easier said than done. In the Lake States, there isn't much of a market for tamarack wood. Tamarack grows in wet, boggy areas, which are only accessible to timber harvesting machinery when soil is frozen. And stands often contain low volumes of small diameter trees. Sorry, I'm having a mouse issue. But we'll why I always have backup script. That said, there is potential to increase the market demand for live, dead, and dying tamarack, but without a strong market, it's especially important to minimize the cost and maximize the effectiveness of tamarack management. So let's go back to our 817,000 acres in Minnesota. There's a big gap in the research regarding not only what happens after ELB disturbance, but whether management interventions are needed. The big overarching question of our research is, how do tamarack forests respond to ELB outbreak, particularly in areas where forest management has not occurred? Basically, when ELB kills overstory trees, what happens next? Our research centers on three key questions. One, what is the composition and structure of tamarack forests impacted by ELB? Two, what tree species regenerate and at what density? And three, what is the relationship between forest composition and structure and regeneration? And for each of these questions, we also want to know if there are differences between stands impacted by ELB at different levels and during different periods of time. So to answer these questions, we sampled tamarack forests in northern Minnesota over 3 summers from 2019 to 2021. Study sites were identified via aerial survey. Each stand was dominated by tamarack and located within a half mile of an accessible road. Stands were classified into 3 categories based on the observed timing and severity of damage. Those categories are low mortality, older high mortality, and recent high mortality. The study consists of 33 sites in Lake of the Woods, Roseau, Marshall, and Beltrami counties. We collected a wide array of data: overstory and understory vegetation, tree cookies from saplings, tree cores from overstory trees, down dead wood, and ground cover vegetation. In this presentation, I'm going to focus just on the vegetation data. So going to our first question, what is the composition and structure of tamarack forests impacted by ELB? In other words, what's there? What do these stands look like after overstory mortality? And does it differ based on when they were hit by ELB? So this figure shows average basal area per acre at each mortality level. Live tamarack is solid dark blue, and standing dead tamarack is dark blue stripes. This figure also shows black spruce and other tree species such as balsam fir, paper birch, and northern white cedar, which I've grouped together as just other species. The lowercase letters above each column represent significant differences or no differences between mean overstory basal area. So we can see there's a significant difference in overstory tamarack between recent high mortality and low mortality stands, but no other major differences in tamarack overstory across mortality levels. The most striking significant difference is in standing dead tamarack density. And this makes sense, right? These mortality levels were determined based on the severity and timing of ELB damage. So we would expect more dead trees in the hardest hit stands. That's why we have these treatment categories. To me, this kind of just proves that statistics is real because our treatment categories are different. What's interesting to me here, though, is the older high mortality stands, the middle group in this figure, don't just have more dead tamarack, they have more overstory density in general. When we look at combined live and dead overstory basal area, so the graph on the left, we see significant differences across mortality levels and timing. We did not collect pre-outbreak density data as part of this study, but looking at the post-outbreak live and dead overstory trees, the high mortality stands have higher overstory density than the low mortality stands. And this is driven largely by the amount of standing dead tamarack. This differs from models that Crocker et al. Developed, which suggested strong ELB preference for larger diameter trees and less dense stands. But the data used in those models was from 2005 to 2014, and our overstory data is from 2019 and 2020. So the outbreak has had time to progress since those models were developed. Larger diameter tamarack tends to grow in less dense stands. So it's likely that by the time of this study, ELB had already colonized most large diameter tamarack trees and moved on to the smaller diameter tamarack present in denser stands. So here's what these stands look like on the ground. There's lots of dead tamarack, sometimes mixed in with live tamarack or sometimes in a mortality pocket. So we know diameter distributions can give us a more detailed picture of stand structure. So looking at a diameter distribution for the low mortality stands, we see a fairly even basal area between live and dead tamarack peaking in the 6 to 7 inch size class. In the older high mortality stands, basal area per acre is higher, peaking again in the 6 inch size class. But here we have much more basal area in dead tamarack than live tamarack. Diameter distribution for the recent high mortality stands looks pretty similar, but with a slightly lower maximum basal area per acre. When comparing all three diameter distributions, we see a similar shape. Unimodal diameter distribution with dead tamarack across all diameter classes. Now in the research from Crocker et al. That I keep mentioning, large diameter was a strong predictor of tamarack mortality. That study found that the trees most likely to be killed by tamarack had a minimum diameter of 12 to 21 inches. I do not see any 12 to 21 inch trees here, really, and I did not in the forest either. So in our data, we really don't have trees that big. And to me, that suggests that ELB really has worked its way through Minnesota's largest tamarack and is now attacking the small stuff in that 6 to 7 diameter range. Another picture break, this is what these diameter distributions actually look like. So we have lots of 6 inch diameter trees with varying densities of dead trees across the mortality levels. Our second question is getting at regeneration. This is basically asking what grows back. This graph shows average trees per acre separated by size class into seedling, sapling, and small trees. The giant light blue striped bars are shrub seedlings. There's a lot of shrub seedlings. But there's no significant differences in shrub densities across mortality levels and size classes. So to me, that says whatever is going on in the overstory, a tamarack stand is still going to have shrubs. This is the same data, but with shrubs removed. The highest seedling density of 635 trees per acre occurs in the older high mortality stands. So again, in the middle of the graph. What's striking here is that there are statistically significant differences across all size classes between the older high mortality and the low mortality stands. But we don't see differences between older and recent high mortality or between recent high and low mortality stands, just with the older high mortality. So this suggests to me that there's something about the older high mortality stands that facilitates seedling growth. It could be stand characteristics like density, site characteristics like native plant community, or perhaps just the amount of time elapsed since the initial ELB damage. The Minnesota DNR guidelines recommend 600 trees per acre, 5 years post initiation as a minimum threshold for successful tamarack regeneration. When we combine average seedlings and saplings per acre, these stands are well above that 600 TPA threshold. That means natural regeneration is occurring with no management intervention. This is really big news, really positive news. There is potential for tamarack stands to regenerate all on their own, but it's important to note that they don't regenerate consistently across all sites. There are some sites where management actions such as seeding or overstory removal may be needed to promote regeneration. So our final question is getting at relationships and getting at the why. Why does this happen? What relationships do we see between forest composition and structure and regeneration? In the interest of time, I'm just going to do a super quick preview of how we're using regression to examine these relationships. So this graph is showing that tamarack regeneration generally increases as overstory basal area decreases, but it varies. You can have 0 overstory and 0 regeneration, or 0 overstory and 3,000 seedlings and saplings per acre. So getting into our key takeaways here. So 1, stands impacted earliest were more dense than stands impacted later, or than stands with minimal ELB impacts. 2, As the ELB outbreak progresses, beetles colonize smaller trees. 3, and this might have the most kind of impact for your actual forest management work for those who are managing tamarack. After overstory damage to ELB outbreak, tamarack can regenerate naturally, but not all sites are going to meet the recommended minimum of 600 trees per acre. So additional exploration is needed to understand the variability in regeneration success. And finally, 4, lower overstory basal area is often correlated with higher regeneration density. But again, there's a lot of variability. So the results I've shared today really just scratch the surface of our questions about tamarack regeneration in the wake of ELB. We have a lot more analysis to do, but it looks like our question of what happens next has a positive answer. After tamarack mortality related to ELB, natural regeneration can and does occur. So on that positive note, I will end my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. And I also just want to draw your attention to the many names on this slide here. This project has been made possible by a ton of input from many folks at the DNR and the University of Minnesota. And it's really been a team effort. So thank you.
All right, next up is Alex Gorman. And we'll, at the end of this block, this discussion, we'll have all the speakers come back up and then y'all can work through questions at that time. Correct, yes. There we go. Right. All right, good morning. So I'm Alex Gorman. I'm a second-year master's student at the University of Minnesota, and want to, huge shout out to my main advisor, Marcelo Campione, and then also my 2 committee members, Matt Russell, and then also Bob Blanchett. So, excuse me. Today I'll be doing just a quick overview of my project, right? Only 5 minutes, and that's on the influence that eastern spruce dwarf mistletoe has on regeneration and what's going on with stand dynamics and all that. So really what's underpinning the whole project are these 2 questions of we want to better understand what dwarf mistletoe is doing to these stands, both pre and post harvest. And then also, is the 5-foot cutting rule, right? Cutting everything over 5 foot. If there's dwarf mistletoe present, is that effective? How's regeneration going? Does it need to be natural? Does it need to, be seeded? So for those of you who might not have had your forest pathology class in a number of years, dwarf mistletoe is a plant parasite, and the one we have here, Arcithobium pusillum, eastern spruce dwarf mistletoe, is native. And essentially what it does is we have our nice healthy spruce tree on the left, and it goes all the way to the right, which is honestly, that tree is about the same size as the one on the left, about 5 feet. And the dwarf mistletoe totally sucks out all the the photosynthates, the water, the nutrients, and so it just totally decimates the stand. Within about 17 years, we see mortality. And just anecdotally, as I've been going through my study, doesn't really matter the diameter or the age of these seedlings or trees for like spruce that it infects. So, a little background. My predecessors measured pre-harvest data for 26 stands, and my project focuses on the post-harvest. And so on DNR administered land, there were 10 or 9 stands that were DNR, 1 was Blandon, but only 10 stands were harvested. So that's what I focused on. And that's what you're seeing in the map here is my harvested stands. So 5 of these stands were infected with dwarf mistletoe, 5 were not. So it was a really very convenient
almost as if I planned it to have a 50-50 split. And we measured slightly over 18,000 seedlings. So regeneration, just like in Amy's, it's occurring. It's definitely there, which is really, really cool. And not something you can see ever, under 3 feet of snow. So just a little look at what these stands look like. So harvested stands with Eastern Spruce Dwarf Mistletoe. That's what ESDM is going to be, is Eastern Spruce Dwarf Mistletoe. This is what they look like. These are what my stands look like. Not every stand, but at least the ones I went to. And I also want to remind you, these were harvested. So these are what the harvested stands look like without dwarf mistletoe. And I just want to reiterate, they're both harvested, but with and without. So what we're looking at, of course, is there's a shift, right? After harvest, of course, you're going to lower your basal area and you're going to remove trees. So obviously the diameter distribution is going to shift, but that diameter post-harvest is still representative across all of those diameter classes. It's not like, oh, we've suddenly taken out all of the large or all of the small, right? It's representative across from the 3-inch all the way up to 16, almost 17 inches in diameter. And that's pre-harvest. So post-harvest, right? That's what we're seeing is your pre-harvest, you have that nice curve, and then post-harvest, it's kind of all over the place in terms of, it's not just even though these are clear cuts, right? Thinking back to that picture, things are still left around. So one thing that's really, really fascinating, we're still, kind of in that preliminary in terms of regeneration, is in these black spruce stands, there's so much tamarack regeneration. So, right, almost, 70% of the regeneration in these black spruce dominated stands is tamarack. So, and we also did residual clump studies, and we also walked the boundary, right? Because plant pathogens, just like fire, don't really care about, the boundaries we set. So that was really interesting to see that, 70% in our EDM stands were infected boundary points, and then 22% of the boundary points in uninfected stands, uninfected stands had mistletoe. So I was just getting at that. Even though you're walking around and the stand is not infected, it could very well be infected. So we also measured residual clumps, which is what we're seeing here, right? All of our infected stands had residuals. So it was interesting walking around these clear cuts that were definitely not clear cut. So yeah, want to go those main takeaways, and I'm a little bit over time. So there is definitely a difference between our pre and post harvest, right, diameter in impacted stands with mistletoe. Regeneration initially is really high. So of course, as time goes on, that's going to change. But for these 2 to 3 year post harvest regeneration is really high. And then dwarf mistletoe is present within the stand and in the boundary, the stands bordering, and that is could have an impact, can't be for certain. So want to acknowledge my funders, and also those my field techs helped me collect data this summer. So thank you.
All right, our next one is on Zoom. Is Ella in the call?
I am. Am I ready to go?
Yep, you're up, Ella. Ella Gray. Yep.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Ella Gray. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota, and I will be continuing to speak about Eastern Spruce Dwarf Mistletoe, but now we're going to zoom out to the landscape scale. As Alex kind of mentioned, we are starting to understand a lot about what's going on at the stand scale. We understand a lot about the pathology of the species, but one big question still is how many stands are infested and kind of where are they? Unfortunately, this is really hard to predict. We validated a model that was created about a decade ago and found that it was about a coin flip. And part of that's just the nature of the infestation. It's hard to kind of have one signature of what these stands look like as they become infested. So for this work, we are taking a little bit of a different approach. Instead, we are modeling landscape level susceptibility of black spruce stands to dwarf mistletoe infestation. To go about this, we use two different data sets, the Minnesota DNR FIM data with almost 15,000 stands and the Forest Service FIA data, and we use just over 300 plots from that data set, looking at just black spruce stands. So we looked at the spatial pattern analysis using Ripley's K and took two modeling approaches to predict which stands are more likely to become infested using random forests and logistic regression, which both predict probability. And then we interpolated those predictions across the study area. So rather than going too deep into methods, let's just jump straight into results. So that Ripley's K spatial pattern analysis basically can tell you if the spatial pattern is clustered, random, or dispersed. And for all of our data sets and all of the ways we measured this, it is clustered. So if you have an infected black spruce stand, there's likely another infected black spruce stand not too far away. And then if we take a look at our predictive maps, so like I said, we had two data sets and two modeling methods. So we have 4 predictive surfaces, and we can see that there are some, patterns that come across all of these, but there's also some differences, and that has to do with data coverage and distribution because, FIA, systematic across the landscape, whereas the FIM represents just the state land. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to focus in on the FIM model using random forests, because that kind of combines a lot of the interesting results from the other models as well. So if we take a closer look at this predictive surface, we can see that there are areas of high susceptibility, that bright purple, and a lot of areas of lower susceptibility. And we can also see it's not equal across the state where the high susceptibility is. So first we see this area up here in central northern Minnesota, where we have a lot of high susceptibility. And this is a region with a lot of black spruce and a lot of black spruce growing in extensive peatlands. It's black spruce next to black spruce next to black spruce. There's not a lot of other forest cover types represented. That's in contrast to this area over here in Lake and St. Louis counties, where again, we have really high susceptibility, but the black spruce is kind of more interspersed with other forest cover types because it's these isolated pockets of peatlands. And then in between, we have this area with maybe a few pockets of higher susceptibility, but it's not as high of a risk area, yet we still have a lot of important black spruce. We have kind of 3 different areas and really 3 different maybe ways of thinking about managing for our black spruce. So if we go to some key takeaways, infested black spruce stands are clustered across multiple spatial scales. So really, if you're worried about dwarf mistletoe, talk to your neighbors, know what's nearby, because that will impact how you manage your black spruce. As well, ESDM infestation susceptibility is not equal across northern Minnesota. So depending on where you are, it's more or less of a worry likely. So really kind of our big takeaway is when thinking about management goals, consider susceptibility in your area. And also really consider what those management goals are and how the two relate to each other. Thank you for listening. I want to just say also thank you to the Department of Forest Resources at the University of Minnesota and Sublab for their support, as well as to the funding agencies for this project, the Minnesota Invasive Terrestrial Plants and Pest Center, as well as the Minnesota Agricultural Experiment Station. Thanks so much. I look forward to any and all questions you may have.
We've gotten a reminder from Eli to, as you're asking questions on Slido, please add the presenter's name at the beginning so we know who the question is directed at.
All right, and it's not paused. All right.
Okay, Great, thanks. Hi, yeah, I'm Kara Glenn Snow, and I'm a graduate student at UMD. And today I'm going to talk to you about, I'm going to kick off the bird section of the day, and I'm going to talk to you about the breeding ecology and the post-fledgling habitat use of boreal chickadees in forested peatlands. But I also want to take a second to acknowledge the Avian Ecology Lab at NRI and my advisor, Alexis Grindy, Marcella, Rob Slezak, and Steve Colby. And how do I advance this? Okay, great. So just a little background information on boreal chickadees. They are small cavity nesting songbirds. They live in the boreal coniferous forests of North America. They are at the very southern end of their range in Minnesota here, and they are strongly associated with mature black spruce dominated forested peatlands. In Minnesota, they are listed as a species in greatest conservation need by the DNR, with declines attributed to habitat loss and fragmentation. And there's limited knowledge on the ecology of these species because they're quite elusive, and also their habitat is kind of difficult to access. So the Avian Ecology Lab at NRI wants to fill some of these knowledge gaps to help with the future conservation efforts of these species. And specifically, our goals are to determine what habitat characteristics are important for breeding boreal chickadees, what kind of cover type the young are using, and how fragmentation affects their movements of like the recently fledged young. This study is being carried out at the Red Lake Wildlife Management Area in the Beltrami State Forest. And within this area, we have 3 main study sites. We have our moose study site, which is mature black spruce dominated stands with a high degree of fragmentation within the surrounding landscape. We have our oak stand, which is, and these are like kind of like the names of our campuses, which is like a mixed age class, black spruce tamarack stand, with also quite a bit of fragmentation within the landscape. And then our West Rapid River site, which is mature black spruce dominated stand, which is more of like a contiguous stand. And our study is focused on the breeding season of boreal chickadees, and specifically the post-fledgling period. So that's like the first few weeks after a bird leaves the nest. And we're interested in this post-fledgling period because it's an extremely vulnerable time for these birds. It's like there's high mortality, there's predation, starvation, exposure, and it's also like a very understudied period in lots of songbirds. So understanding what birds do, where they go, what kind of habitat they use during this period of time, it can be really important for conservation efforts. So to help us learn more about this stage in boreal chickadees, we've been using handheld telemetry to track their daily movements after they leave the nest. And at each point where we locate these birds, we've been conducting vegetation surveys, so gathering data on the tree count, species, canopy composition, average tree height, and canopy density. So we're kind of trying to figure out like what kind of cover these birds are choosing. So here are some images that just showing like some of the locations where we've tracked the birds over the last couple of years. And you can kind of notice that the chickadees are like more restricted to the interior parts of these stands. And we're also looking at juvenile movement. So like how far these birds are moving daily, what their kind of like maximum daily distance is. And that can give us some insight into their physiological restrictions and limitations, and also how their movement might be impacted by fragmentation. I have like a little video, but I don't know if it's going to play. Doesn't look like it. Well, imagine movement. So what we've learned so far is that like young birds are, they're using large areas of the forest after leaving the nest, and they're avoiding clear cuts, and they're choosing areas of mature black spruce with higher canopy density, and they're avoiding like really abrupt edges between open habitat and the forest. But there's still like so much more that we have to learn about these birds, like what they do in the winter, for example, and how far they go after they disperse from their parents' territory. But what we have learned so far can help us inform us on how we can alter harvest practices to help conserve the species habitat and mitigate declines. So we can consider like extended age rotation for black spruce. The species is really dependent on really mature black spruce forests. And we also have found that they are like edge avoidant species. So in areas where there is a harvest of black spruce, we can create, if we could create kind of like a gradient between the harvested area and like the canopy, like to create some kind of like softer boundary, that creates like a very unique habitat, not only for that boreal chickadees will use, but also for other species as well. And also, how can we reduce fragmentation within the landscape? So these young birds they're mobile after leaving the nest, but they're not really moving more than like a few hundred meters a day in their post-fledging period. So these large areas of clear cut might really restrict their movement. So how can we try to increase the connectivity of our mature black spruce forests? And finally, so these birds are cavity nesters, as I said, so trying to, if possible, like leave some kind of dead standing trees is not only really important for the breeding of these species, but also for like lots of other bird and other critters as well. And yeah, all right. So yeah, thanks for your time. If anybody has any questions on boreal chickadees and their habitat use, I'll be at my poster later. Thanks.
Awesome. Next up is Steve Colby.
Great. All right, good morning, everyone. You just heard a lot about one of my favorite birds, boreal chickadee, and now you're about to hear about another one of my favorite birds, which is Connecticut warbler. I'm happy to be up here to share some results from a study we've been undertaking the last few years, looking at this species in northern Minnesota. And I'm happy to show some of the results on behalf of a lot of members of my lab listed here, as well as project partners down in the cities. But please first let me introduce you to the Connecticut warbler. Many of you likely don't know what this bird is or haven't seen too many. It's not a bird that you're going to regularly see hanging around your backyard or even in local parks. Connecticut warblers are 5 or 6 inch long, so small warblers. They have a gray head and a really bright white eye-ring. Lovely birds. You'll basically never see them like that on the left. What you're gonna see is them peering out at you from some dense understory brush stuff, like you see in the picture on the right there. The best way to see them, and they're very emblematic, but also sort of enigmatic bird of northern black spruce and tamarack forest. The best way to encounter them is to trudge out there and listen for their gloriously loud song, and hopefully we can play it here. So they sit up in the top of tamaracks or black spruce and just crank this out over and over again all morning long from late May and through the month of June. And then you just basically just disappear and sort of vanish off the face of the earth. And in a lot of ways that is the case. They're going an awful long way away from the breeding range in green there in the North Woods. They just as this sort of a fun aside to this for this species, they in the fall migrate to the East Coast, usually hit somewhere in the mid-Atlantic region and then blast off over the Atlantic Ocean, catch the trade winds as they're out over the ocean in a nonstop flight and land on the Greater Antilles and eventually wind their way down to the Western Amazon basin in a very remote and intact portion of South America. That's amazing. I think you'll all agree for a little bird to do that every year. But if we sort of focus our attention back to the breeding range, you'll note that this is the abundance of Connecticut warblers that was modeled all across their range. And you'll note that despite the fact that we're on the very southern edge of where they breed, we also have some of the brightest red, the highest abundances of this bird on the planet. And that bright red area corresponds, as many of you likely know, to the Agassiz lowlands ecological subsection, which is dominated by large tracts of black spruce and tamarack that these birds prefer. This habitat looks like this. Tamarack forest on the left there, black spruce on the right. They are sort of habitat specialists in that they are sort of like a Goldilocks situation. They don't like very dense black spruce stands like Kara's boreal chickadees do. They don't like super open stands, but they do like a somewhat open canopy. So it's sort of they're like a happy medium. One thing that's not so happy about Connecticut warblers is that they are sharply declining. Their populations are sharply declining. The avian ecology lab that I work for at NRI monitors forest birds in the national forest every year since 1995. And you can see no matter where we look, Superior National Forest, Chippewa National Forest, or across the region, Connecticut warblers are declining in no uncertain terms. That decline is mirrored in the right there by the North American Breeding Bird Survey. So this bird is also a species in greatest conservation need in Minnesota. And so, you know, we as a group decided it's about time somebody took a good hard look at this species and what's going on and what hopefully we can do about it. There has been a little bit of research on this bird and what it's focused on is, as I mentioned, the time when the males are sitting in the tops of trees and blasting out that song. We can infer a lot of information about what the species needs because they are easy to hear. However, as I mentioned, the rest of the time you'd never see them. They're extremely secretive. And as you can see there, that quote on the bottom there says, well, basically all we know is based on one nest that was found once upon a time. So that's not great, right? So we need to know more, and we need to know a lot more. We need to know it sooner rather than later to try to pull them out of this pretty obvious and steep decline. Another thing, in recent years, more and more research is coming for a variety of species that just because we understand what a singing male bird is doing, where it's singing from, and we can predict that, does not mean that that is the same habitats, the same size of patches and stuff like that, that females need to nest in, and also young birds need after they leave that nest during that vulnerable period of their lives. So we initiated a study in 2019 and 2020 in the Saxon Bog in 2019, so in sort of central St. Louis County. And then in 2020, we went up to the Red Lakes WMA. On the right there, you can see male singing territories are in white circles, and nests that we found are in yellow stars. So over the course of 2 years, we found 11 nests. So that was a nice sort of upping the samples, our all collective sample size of Connecticut warbler nests known in the world. And we did a lot of nest measurement and vegetation measurement, so on and so forth, which we won't get into today, but that was also a valuable contribution of this project. And, you know, there's a reason why only a few nests have been found, and that is that they're very difficult to find. That's a Connecticut warbler nest. There's like a little hollow you can see in the sphagnum moss there. Got some Labrador tea nearby, a tamarack, it looks like. And so these birds scurry around the ground and shuffle around and go to their nest, and they're very hard to find, but eventually you do, and it's very rewarding because you're like, oh, look how there's some eggs. And then eventually they hatch into cute little alien looking bird things. And then they start to look a little bit more like birds. And what we did in this study, similar to some of the things that Kara was just talking about with boreal chickadees, is right before they leave their nest, we take them out carefully and put transmitters on them. And then they leave the nest and they're sort of a little scruffy looking and sort of got that awkward teenage phase thing going on. But we track them around, and when we, you know, mark where they are every day, and do all sorts of vegetation surveys and things along those lines at the points where they are located. Now, why do we do this? Kara mentioned that this time in a bird's life is very vulnerable. It's where, as you saw on the right here, this figure shows this is weekly survival rates. So if your weekly survival rate was somewhere, around 80%, that's not great, right? That's pretty low. And so, but as you can see, as the bird ages, getting to 5, 6, 7 weeks old, that survival rate gets a lot higher. So that period of time right after they leave the nest, before they become sort of full-fledged birds and can start moving around like all the other birds that we see out in the world, we have to know what they're doing and why they're doing it. Incidentally, the only time we're ever going to get more Connecticut warblers in the world, which is sort of how you would pull birds out of the decline, is on the breeding grounds in northern Minnesota and other places where they breed, because all the other time during that annual cycle, we're only losing birds. So it was an awful lot of work finding those nests and tracking those birds, and we were able to produce some data that looked like this, and sort of, this is all brand new novel information, basically showing what these birds are capable on any given day. So like on day 1, so that's the day after they leave the nest, the farthest we ever tracked a bird was about 40 meters away from its previous location, and so on and so forth. And you can see that it doesn't change much above 100 meters until they get to be 2.5 weeks old or so. Similarly, look at distance from their nest. And one thing that, maybe you wouldn't intuitively know, but somewhere around 150 or 200 meters is not very far for a bird to go 2-3 weeks after it leaves the nest. That's a very small area to go. Very unlike what Kara just described with the boreal chickadees, where they're going kilometers at a time, sometimes away from their nest. These things are going tens of meters. And so what does that mean? Well, if we sort of overlay that distance on top of the territories that we mapped and from the nest in which they hatch, we can see there's an insane amount of overlap, right? And so this is really good news because, as we mentioned, Connecticut warblers are really hard to work with. It takes an awful lot of time. We spent hundreds of hours looking for those 11 nests. But what is really good news is that because they don't do crazy movements where they go 2 kilometers a day away and go to some different habitat like some birds do, they stick around sort of in the same areas as where the males are singing. So that's great because we know we can do stuff with singing males. That's much easier to work with and extrapolate from than doing a detailed study like this. So that's really great news. We can use all the knowledge that we have gained about male Connecticut warblers and sort of infer things about females nesting and then fledglings leaving that nest. However, of course, there's still bad news, right? That doesn't solve much of anything. We do know that Connecticut warblers are declining. Recent analyses from other folks around the country are pointing to the fact that habitat reduction and degradation is almost certainly the cause of this species decline. Where they winter in South America is still a very high quality habitat. And so we're looking at ourselves here and what's going on. And we do know that Connecticut warblers, they require large tracts of black spruce and tamarack. That Goldilocks thing I was saying, they really need a specific type of basal area and density of stems on the ground as well for hiding in while they're nesting. And so I think the bottom line is that if you have a massive stand, you're more likely to, in that stand, have pockets where a Connecticut warbler is going to be hanging out and saying, yeah, that's exactly what I'm looking for. And if you have very small pockets, it's possible that it'll have that same attributes, but it's less likely. Also, as we've been hearing about this morning, there's an ongoing infestation from larch beetle on tamarack, and simply put, we don't know what it's doing to a lot of the bird species, but it's certainly affecting bird species and Connecticut warbler, and almost certainly in a negative way. In addition, the black spruce harvesting practices that are occurring and have been occurring are not doing a whole lot of favors for Connecticut warblers. In particular, we have some recommendations thinking about the fragmentation of the landscape, smaller patchier cuts rather than very large contiguous cuts would help. Retaining trees would also absolutely help. Getting any amount of sort of heterogeneity in the forest, in the black spruce would help, so that the connected warblers can find what they're looking for. Extending the rotation periods would possibly, increase mistletoe and things of that nature, and other natural mortality. From a bird's perspective, mistletoe is often really nice. It creates lots of new opportunities for many bird species, not just connected warblers, but oftentimes including connected warblers. And finally, any amount of feathering of edges to reduce hard edges could actually provide some really nice habitat that's sort of halfway between those two, not or overly dense and then not dense enough. And in that vein, just recently, this prescription was given to the DNR Forestry, and they are able to implement a number of different experimental cuts in one of our sites in the Red Lake WMA. This was recently sold. We're very excited about that. And so we're going to have a number of, we have sort of thicker strip cuts, thinner strip cuts, and then on the western half, you can see a number of group selections. And all of these are going to have nice feathering of the edges. You can see sort of in gray around the edges. And so our hope is that we can maintain a lot of the resident birds that would be living in the stand, and also create additional habitat for species like connected warbler that require things along these lines. We're certainly not advocating for going around and doing this to all the spruce stands in the state, but if if the stand is going to be harvested anyway, implementing even something that remotely mirrors this or has features of this would do a great deal for many breeding bird species. And with that, I'll just say this is a very small part of a large project that was funded through the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, looking at peatland lowland conifer forests throughout the state. And I also would like to acknowledge that the Minnesota DNR, a lot of thanks for providing housing and other logistical support in the Red Lake WMA, both for this project and for the Boreal Chickadee project. I look forward to talking with you all at any point later with questions, and thank you.
All right, next up is Mike North.
Hi, I'm Mike North with the Minnesota DNR. Thank you for allowing me to talk to you about the dispersion of a black-backed woodpecker community around an apparent communal feeding area up in the Beltrami Island State Forest. So the DNR manages 86,000 acres of federal land north of Upper Red Lake. It's called the Land Utilization Project. And these land parcels are part of the National Wildlife Refuge System. And in 1997, Congress required that plans be developed for all units of the National Wildlife Refuge System. So the DNR and Fish and Wildlife Service cooperatively put together a management plan for the Land Utilization Project. And the very first objective out of over 24 objectives in the plan is to implement a robust research, inventory, and monitoring program. And one of the specific action items in the plan was to study all aspects of three-toed woodpecker and black-backed woodpecker ecology when opportunities arise. So black-backed and three-toed woodpeckers are generally species of conservation concern, recognized by various agencies as such, because they are fairly rare and they are habitat specialists. So In order to implement the plan, we started doing a few things opportunistically. In 2015, there was a 4,000 acre fire called the Paulsburg Burn. And immediately after the fire happened, we set up 50 point counts within the burn area and 50 point counts around the perimeter of the burn area to monitor avian responses. And we ended up finding black-backed woodpeckers at 8 of the burn, or from 8 of the point counts in the burn area and 3 point counts outside of the burn area in the perimeter. And we ended up banding 3 pairs of birds that year. In 2018, we had some Bemidji State University students contract with us to run some transects through the forest as part of a pilot of a general woodpecker use study. And they occasionally found some black-backed woodpeckers and signs of use along the transects. And then from 2019 to 2020, we continued to log incidental observations and sightings, including the first 3-toed woodpecker nest outside of northeastern Minnesota, and that was found by Steve Kolb here from NRI. And we maintain a GIS database of all of the observations of black-backed woodpeckers and 3-toed woodpeckers that come to our attention in Minnesota. So to build off of that, in 2021, we hired 2 contractors to look specifically for black-backed and 3-toed woodpeckers in 4 locations. One 3-toed woodpecker nest that was found by NRI staff was monitored by our contractor. That was along the Rapid River Forest Road. And then at another site, we found 2 black-backed woodpecker nests and multiple detections around the Paulsburg burn area. And we color banded one of those pairs, and we're going to talk a bit more about what we found there. So black-backed and 3-toed woodpeckers use a variety of habitats. The 2 species share an affinity for old lowland conifers, mature red and white pine forests, and burned areas, but they also have a little bit of differences between them. The black-backed woodpeckers like savanna-like settings, which include pine plantations and thinnings, whereas 3-toed woodpeckers are known to also like to use flooded areas such as created by beavers. So in 2021, our contractor there found 2 nests in one area. And these are represented by the green dots here. The northern green dot was in a red pine plantation, 52 years old. And this one here was in a 52-year-old jack pine stand. And this was right at the edge of the Paulsburg burn. The purple line represents the burn boundary, with the burn occurring off to the right and unburned timber to the left. We also had 2 additional sightings in this area. There was a fresh inactive nest up here in a 71-year-old jack pine stand. And there was feeding activity witnessed in a 65-year-old jack pine stand down here. So there were at least 3 pairs of black-backed woodpeckers, possibly 4, along with hairy woodpeckers and northern flickers that fed intensely in this area of pines that were flooded due to a heavy storm event in 2019. And these red pine and jack pine in here were killed by that flood event. And the color banded male from the nest up here was observed here, feeding here. And these 2 nests are about 0.2 miles apart. The male moved 0.27 miles from the feeding area up to the nesting area. And so the takeaways that dispersed nesting around a communal feeding area might be a common feature in the ecology of black-backed woodpeckers. Savanna-like red pine plantation settings can be good habitat. However, old jack pine appears to be an important habitat component as well. And if you can retain dead trees as long as you can, that would be helpful for providing a food source for these woodpeckers. And in order to be able to maintain retaining trees as long as possible, you kind of have to know what the beetle life history is, because you don't want the beetles to also expand to live timber if you can avoid it. And I wanted to share with you, let's see here. I was hoping to show okay, here. So in this one, the woodpecker is going to come in to feed her young at the nest. And you can hear the young begging for food. It's that begging call that is the best way to find woodpecker nests. Just listen for the young to be begging for food. And it can be fairly incessant. Yeah, these are going to be very short. Less than 30 seconds here. This one is just a bird feeding, but hopefully you can hear the beetles actually crunching on the wood. And then we wonder if we can hear woodpecker young feeding or begging for food. Can predators do that? The answer is yes. This is the day after we filmed the first slide here. And as far as we can determine, the hawk did not get anything from the nest. So, thank you.
There you are. Okay, so I'm Josh Bedner. I work with Dr. Alexis Grindy at the Natural Resources Research Institute in the Avian Ecology Lab. People that helped out with this project are my counterparts, Steve Colby, Reed Siebers, and Stephen Nelson for this project. This project was brought in part by the U.S. Forest Service folks in the Chippewa National Forest and in partnership with the Rough Grouse Society. So today I'm going to talk about the Chippewa National Forest Hunter Walking Trail Breeding Bird Habitat Improvement Project. Okay, just some background. There's over 600 miles of hunter walking trails in the state of Minnesota, and they provide many opportunities, recreational opportunities from hunting to wildlife viewing. So the folks in the Chippewa National Forest had an idea. They wanted to enhance some of the habitat along the hunter walking trails. And so they've got a roughly 10-year project that started here a few years back, and they're going to do a lot of small frequent cuts along the hunter walking trails that they have there. So classic rough grouse habitat is maintaining a mix of multiple age classes of aspen of relatively small patch sizes. And our question is what impacts do smaller, more frequent harvests have on breeding bird populations? So the goal is to create and maintain a diverse habitat matrix for rough grouse and breeding bird species. So this is an example of one of our 4 locations in the Chippewa National Forest. This is the Morph Meadows Hunter Walking Trail. All the polygons here are roughly 5 acres or less in size. Everything in orange is currently being harvested this winter. That represents 1/4 of the stand. And then in 5 years, what's in yellow is going to be harvested in roughly 2026. So where we've collected 2 years of pre-harvest data for this project. And the way we did that was we used line transect surveys. We did 2 rounds of surveys both years in 2020 and 2021, one in late April to assess our game birds, and then one in June to assess our songbirds. In addition to the line transect surveys, we put out autonomous recording units or ARUs, and we can program them to record at specific times of the day. We put these out from April to June, and this is going to give us a really better comprehensive understanding of what's at the hunter walking trail sites. So just some quick results here. We had really good numbers of rough grouse at all 4 hunter walking trail locations. 2021 numbers were slightly lower than 2020. This shadows the DNR's roadside surveys that they conduct every spring. And then what we're predicting is that rough grouse abundance is going to go up post-harvest. So from the breeding bird surveys that we conducted in June, mature forest specialists like ovenbirds, red-eyed vireos still continue to dominate the world. The early successional type specialists, American woodcock, golden warbler, and veery were less common. We predict them are going to be more common post-harvest. So this is an output of one of our ARUs. We put the ARUs out over the course of 2 years. We detected 24,000 rough grouse drums. Detected them on all days that they were put out, except for when we had poor weather. And at this ARU location, the kind of the faint yellow-green bars that are vertical represent 3 drumming rough grouse. So with conclusions, it's forest management is our tool to kind of create these unique habitat opportunities, and sometimes it takes partnerships that the Chippewa National Forest has with the RGS to get some of this habitat work done. A little bit about this site. The project sold at a premium. There were no issues selling the sites, even with how small they were. And it's going to be really important to monitor this for the next 10 years. You know, we've had 2 years of pre-harvest data. Typically, we only get 2 years to come in and do post-harvest monitoring, but for this project here, we have upwards of 10 years, and we're really excited about that. If you have any questions, feel free to talk to me at my poster board out in the hall.
Stay up here. We'll have all the other speakers come on down, please. So the Z-Link for Slido, I urge you all to upvote questions. We won't be able to get to all of them. We're abundantly crunched for time here. So just trying to make sure the most upvoted questions can get answered here.
And that mic actually picks up very well. So you have that are speakers, you shouldn't have to get right next to the mic for people still to be able to hear you online.
All right, looks like a question for Amy. Does post-infestation management or cleanup of dead tamarack improve regeneration?
I think I saw Marcella had chimed in online on this one too. We don't know for sure. We suspect maybe, but this would be kind of a direction that the research would head in the future. So a lot of questions around salvage harvesting and if overstory removal would impact the regeneration. So it's a good question. And if anyone has money to pay us to answer it, let us know.
Yes, nice point.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I guess I would say there too, just quickly is another part of my research that I didn't talk about is looking at tree ring analysis from cookies. So we have like 756 cookies from 1 to 3 inch diameter tamarack saplings. And some of them are, you know, maybe like 12 years old, but some of them are 50, 55 years old. So they're saplings that have been hanging out in the understory since the 1960s. So kind of another thing we're hoping to figure out, maybe not necessarily with my research, but in later phases is in addition to the seedlings that have regenerated, kind of what's going on with these saplings in the understory and how can we use harvesting or other treatments to manage that advanced regeneration.
Another question for you, Amy. Do you feel the Minnesota DNR stocking guidelines, 600 seedlings per acre, fairly represent how the stands in your project are naturally regenerating? Do you feel the goal of 600 seedlings per acre is a realistic target?
Yeah, I think so. And I think Paul had chimed in on the Slido that it's realistic. I mean, I guess, you know, what stands out to me is sort of like a red flag there is just like seedlings don't equal a mature forest, right? So we need to get from seedling to sapling to small tree. And as I just mentioned, apparently that process can take 60 years. So kind of some thinking to do there about, well, how shade intolerant is tamarack really? And I've also observed a lot of regeneration is sort of like patchy. So you'll get like a lot of seedlings on like a mossy hummock or on a dead log. But kind of depends on some of those ground cover conditions, which is another thing we have data for that we haven't really looked into yet.
Question for you, Steve. Besides the large beetle outbreak, are there other landscape level changes that correlate with the start of the Connecticut warbler decline? For example, changes in boreal forest harvesting in Minnesota or Canada that coincided with decline?
Yeah, I think the biggest driver of the decline is just the sort of the larger scale incursion into like, more and more remote areas and larger harvests of the preferred habitat. Yeah. And then, of course, there's all sorts of other, less than good ideal things. Connecticut warblers are not nearly alone in their decline amongst other birds. And so there's things that are happening during migration in particular, loss of stopover habitat, and, issues along there that probably are exacerbating the decline.
Another question for you. If Connecticut warblers have smaller dispersal areas, then how big of a spruce stand is large enough?
Yeah, that's a good question, I think. Right, if you just took it on the face value and said, yeah, they don't really seem to go very far, you could have a spruce stand that's just a few hundred square meters. That might be the case, although I don't think that, any of us have seen that. It does appear that they even though they don't seem to need, as a family unit, don't seem to have to go super far, they don't seem to be attracted to very small stands. Another thing that happens with Connecticut warblers is that it seems like they're very attracted to other conspecific singing. So it's like there's this sort of positive feedback that happens where they're in the area looking for a place to breed, and they hear a male singing, and then they hop on board. They're like, oh, it must be a good site. And then there's two singing there, and then another one comes by, and so on and so forth. I think that's probably why we don't see them in very small stands. But on the face of it, seems like they could do that in relatively small stands.
While you're at it, in some ways you're suggesting that larger cuts with less patchiness would improve habitat conditions, which you follow by suggesting feathered edges and a partial cut from the WMA on the last slides. Please clarify.
Right. So I think what I'm trying to say is, in an ideal world from a Connecticut warbler's perspective, wouldn't be doing much cutting at all. Right. But if you have to, doing anything beyond taking large patches out of the landscape, feathering some of those edges, leaving some trees, so on and so forth, anything like that would be better than not doing those things. And so what we're experimenting with is some alternative where you can still get some profit off of the land, and then also retain or even attract Connecticut warblers.
I'm gonna give
Question
Steve a
for-
break. I have one quick comment. So he can
Thank
breathe.
goodness,
No,
yeah.
I just wanted to say, super cool morning for Beltrami Island State Forest, because
Right,
like
yeah,
half of the
yeah.
research was up there. And Steve and Kara and I think others here actually stayed at the same place. So we were kind of ships passing in the night with the schedule for birds versus trees, but just a super cool plug for this event, that it's really cool to be here and kind of get to reconnect with people who've been, we probably have like the same stands, but we're too tired during the summer to really talk about what each other is doing. So just thanks to the event organizers for getting us together. Okay.
Question for actually Amy, Alex, and Ella. I'll highlight this. Good to know Tamarack is regenerating. Will we ever have large mature tamarack on the landscape again, or will ELB kill them off as they grow? It looks pretty bleak.
Well, Brian Schwindel has told me to be careful about not making it seem super bleak. I think there's a lot of doom and gloom in forest health. That said, I think something would have to change, I think, to see large tamarack able to survive. But entomologists at the University of Minnesota in the Acoma lab are doing a ton of research on ELB, developing lures for more effective monitoring. So scientifically, I guess my answer to that would be like, yeah, probably. And anecdotally, I haven't seen it. I don't know, you guys, sorry.
I'll chime in with that too, because I have actually seen some larger tamarack, I'm going to say relatively large because I work in black spruce stands. So you'll every once in a while come along across this small patch of, foot plus diameter tamarack. So I think they're there, but just maybe not in these big extensive areas or in pure stands. So it might just change how they appear on the landscape versus eliminate them.
Yeah, I'd echo that. Exactly what Alan and I work very similar, except I work with clear cuts. And we'd have, come across one massive tamarack and it's okay, that's where all 300 seedlings in a square meter are coming from. I think it's important, like what Amy said, seedlings don't necessarily translate to mature timber, right? So.
You're good start.
And the service take over.
Amy, are there plans to do follow-up analysis to better understand which sites would need artificial regeneration?
Yeah, definitely. So this project is bigger than just me, and when I'm done with grad school, hopefully others on our team at U of M and the DNR will be able to continue looking into this. I mean, the DNR has been looking into Tamarac's future for a long time. There was 2013 Tamarack Assessment Project. So a lot of work going on there. And I think kind of my research is sort of taking a first stab at just like what is even going on, and a bigger question, the follow-up question to that is why? Why do we see this variability? So we're definitely not leaving it for now at just we don't know, but I don't have an answer now. So
Steve, do we know why there's a big increase in Connecticut warbler populations in the late 80s?
Somebody might know, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think we had a lot of quality habitat, and just to kind of touch on what Steve's been saying. So when you come in and you harvest a site, say 200, 300, 400 acres, it's gonna take, and we had Connecticut warblers there, it's gonna take that site maybe 30 or 40 years to become right for them to just get back. It's not like aspen, where aspen's maturing at 40 years and we're cutting it. Some of these sites are taking a really long time, so that's kind of what we're up against is time. Okay, so.
Steve, with recent moose research, the moose decline in Minnesota is attributed to both elevated adult mortality and poor calf survival. Could something similar be happening with warblers, or is data lacking on adult mortality?
Certainly something could be happening along those lines. And yes, data is lacking on every portion of the Connecticut warblers life cycle. But yeah, I mean, there's some evidence to suggest, and I guess I could address this one here too, that you know, that breeding habitat loss and degradation is likely the main, or like sort of 1A driver for the decline of Connecticut warblers. But then, yeah, there's a bunch of bad stuff that's happening on migration, particularly, you know, on our continent before they get over the ocean. That, you know, like for example, collisions with buildings and towers and stuff like that is a major concern with Connecticut warblers.
Awesome. Well, that's all the time we have. So thank you all very much for sending in questions and upvoting and participating.
You all are getting a sense of how the day's going to work. We're going to have a number of presentations, and we're going to have a block of questions, and then we've got half an hour built in for breaks and networking. So take advantage of that time in the way that's best for you, whether that's stepping outside and getting alone for a little bit because you're overwhelmed with so many people and you haven't been with 60 people for a while. That's totally okay. Or if it's to check in on that question that didn't get answered live with the presenter. We encourage you to do what's right for you in the next half an hour. When we come back from break, we'll get a keynote presentation from Jamie Dahl. And so I encourage you to get back by 2 minutes before 10:30, so then we can get rolling right away at 10:30. So enjoy the next half hour. And I was going to say some questions. The place to do it would be